Hello, everyone. So we can't have a class because it's my birthday. Not that I mm, was planning to celebrate my 56th birthday, but some other people are. So it would be really difficult for me to manage. I had another meeting. So I came to the office, and then even after if when I drive back at 3, there won't be much possibility. Sorry for that. But I'll record a lecture. And as promised, we have those 3 lectures from Chomsky, 3 small videos, which are shared for the very reason of understanding how media, what are Chomsky's views on the media, and especially this one, how does an education system work in a modern society? Uh, since you are students, we are in the business of teaching. We have high hopes from it, and the whole society looks at us, and people think that whatever we do is going to affect the society in the best possible way if we do a good job, and if you are good students, it will again be beneficial for the society. Chomsky is not challenging the existence of this possibility, and nor am I. Chomsky just tries to give you an idea of how things really work. And this is what he aims at. Like, whenever you read him or view his views, don't take it as a nihilist, somebody who plans to destroy human society. Some people blame him for that. And please don't take the same opinion about me when I tell you about Chomsky. But what Chomsky tries to instill in our minds is vigilance in keeping a democracy functioning, and also uh, critical thinking, that we should be citizens who won't be taking things for granted and who really be looking for all areas of knowledge in the modern society, because democracy itself is eternal vigilance, and vigilance comes through knowledge which is based in critical thinking, not rote learning. So I'll just do the same as I did with the earlier videos, and I hope it's useful. Yeah. So here is the first part that I would like to discuss. First, look at the question the journalist asks. So basically, if you are studying journalism or communication studies, you should know which questions to ask and how to ask. Like framing your question is important. Then the way Chomsky defines it, its education is a system of indoctrination of the young to sift out the obedient ones who are happy to become part of a system and leave others out which are not obedient enough and who don't serve the status quo. Uh, Now, this doesn't mean that Chomsky doesn't mean that students who don't study are the ones who are more intelligent. But he says that some of us make conscious decision. Okay, for the first step, let's uh, go through the system. I did it basically. I had and still have uh, a very critical view of the education system, and I entered the education system. I left it. I studied on my own. I left school. Like I was never satisfied with the way things are. Most of you might be, but then the question is whether you are dissatisfied with the education system because you don't want to work, or whether you are dissatisfied with the system that you are critical enough to understand what's right and wrong. Now, people like us, myself, as Chomsky mentions himself, and many others, are critical of the system, but they still go through it. And I always say that if you are critical of the system, first you have to satisfy the requirements of the system. Somehow make sure that nobody blames you of not being able to go through the system, and they say, okay, since you couldn't do it, so you are against it. If you do that, as he says, you might end up jobless, end up being on the street, a social pariah, or God forbid, a drug addict, because you will be considered a behavioral problem. So avoid that if you want to survive in a system, but keep your critical thinking structure at work. Don't let it go. And here is where he says that uh, what is done in the system, the way students are rewarded, is on the basis of selection of obedience. For example, if you are a student who asks questions all the time, you are pretty conditioned, by the way, I must tell you this. Like you never ask questions because you think the questions might hurt you in the end, or you don't think. If you don't think, it means that this is what Chomsky says, you are part of the 80% who are considered to uh, unthinking and just going with the flow and things like that. If you feel like being in that category, please get out of it. Start thinking. It's very important. Societies might operate on the surface on obedience, but they excel on the basis of critical minds. Like knowledge is basically critical thinking. If you can't do it, you are out of it. So, and also he mentions the elite universities are more conformist than other institutions. There are no other institutions. They are basically elite universities, then others who wants to be elite, and some of them are just selling degrees. These are the worst kinds. So overall, what he says is that the process of conditioning of and conformity and obedience is instilled in us through the education system. Now the next step is very interesting, where uh, Chomsky mentions that there is a very strong contradiction in our modern society, because on the one hand, it wants conformist citizens, like people who are obedient, who just follow the line, and they do all the things that are asked of them. But on the other hand, this society works on the basis of innovation, like creativity, new thought in all spheres. So, how can you train one person in two contradictory behaviors? That's not possible. And that's also one of the biggest reasons of uh, of our mental problems, basically, in modern society. Like in the US last year, from January to September, 80,000 people died of the US opiate problem. Like people who take stimulants, like sleeping pills, other sedatives, to remain normal. Normalcy in itself is a big problem, but the contradiction that comes with with over correctness and innovation really is tearing apart modern societies. It's a huge problem. He gives the example of Japan. Where I have some personal experience. My son was in Japan with a. He had a Japanese um, flatmate, so there he rented an apartment in his university, and here he was with a Japanese. The Japanese guy told him that they are students of medicine. The Japanese guys told him that they haven't studied physics, like like they were simply studying biology and chemistry, and he couldn't speak good English, and he could adjust to a society which was not very modern. Like it's kind of Bulgaria is not the U.S. or it's not Germany, but he just left for Ukraine. He couldn't cope with 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 the day to day dealing with other human beings, because he came up from a very conformist society where obedience, what we call also respect is it's a difficult thing, uh, was not there. So I think it's, and then there it becomes a structural constraint, basically. Like nobody asks you to do something, but within the structure it's there. Like if I speak something stupid, you won't really object to it because our culture doesn't allow it. Some of you might be not be objecting not to get into trouble with your instructor and get a bad grade, but most of you will be doing it. Okay, he's an older guy, and he might be knowing it, well, despite the fact that you might be knowing that what I'm saying is wrong. So most of the time, uh, innovation is not nurtured because we are too focused uh, on what we call respect, and we don't understand what the meaning of respect is. And the problem is that we can't have any uh, critical thinking going if we are too cautious to speak our minds. But this is what the system tells us, like it's structural, where you can't speak, and you don't have much cultural options to speak. Uh, and also, Chomsky is of the opinion that that conformity is easier to find in ideological subject like religious studies, for example, because whatever is written, like it's there. You don't need to challenge it, because the very idea of challenging religious thought means that you don't believe in a religion. So why are you studying it then? And the question is that the more religious a society is, the more conformist it would become. And then you will have less room for innovation, basically, because you are not critical. Some people think that the US is this huge, great society which is critically thinking human beings. That's not true, also. The US is not New York or DC is not a big city, or LA. It's kind of small pockets, 350 million people living in the country. Most of them are religious. So it's not against religious, but it's being religious. But the problem here is that you can't really put two souls in one body. Like you can't be innovative and conformative at the same time. If you have a culture of conformity, you can let go of the idea of having innovation. And this is the problem of most developing societies, including Pakistan. Yeah, here is about what we call the curriculum. In Pakistan, we are going through this phase where they are going for a national curriculum. By the way, overconformity leads to fascism, which is pretty obvious in society, in developing societies, in the name of national security, and giving everybody the same opportunity. If you decide to kill innovation, it's going to be dangerous. It's going to be create a system of thought where people will take most of the stuff that they read literally, and they will make historical comparisons which are untenable for a thinking mind. As he gives the example of Bloom, what he did was that a student unrest, which forced the students to take over a university administration, which in the end was was solved. The whole problem was solved. He uh, went as far as making it like synonymous to a Nazi uh, uprising on campus because the students were black, and also considered the teachers as aiders and abettors of fascism, which is wrong. And you can see this in your own society because uh, people are being blamed of being blasphemous, uh, like traitors, and all these extreme words are thrown towards people because the curriculum is so restrained. Like it's many people think that rote learning is the problem, but rote learning is not the problem. The problem basically is when you confine education to a number of books or readings and don't allow anything outside of that. Like you take away freedom out of the hands of young men and women uh, at undergraduate level. Basically, at the school level, it is conformist. But like if you see, there are kind of elite schools in Pakistan, so they have critical thinking as one subject, and students go on to write all sorts of stuff. They are allowed to do that. I remember a meeting with my son's teacher, and she said that he writes wonderfully, but his essay is about demons and stuff like that, and he might not get good scores at Cambridge exams. And I said, did you speak with him? They said, yes, but he says this is what it is. Like, it's an English language test, and I wrote an assignment which has nothing to do with facts. So this is what I'm doing. And I said, okay, I'll speak to my son. And I spoke with him. I got the same answer. He said, no, I'm not going to change it. It's remained the same. They will, if they wish to fail me in a Cambridge exam, they can do that. He passed it. Like, he passed it with really flying colors. He went to Cambridge also. He passed an interview for engineering. And then he decided to go to Hong Kong. Like, there are schools in this same country which are allowing critical thought, but there are majority of them are not. And out of that comes, and it also, as Chomsky says, there are individual teachers who try to instill freedom of thought and expression, critical thinking, ask you to ask questions and things like that. But that's not the overall structure. Like, the overall structure is basically conformist, and the whole education system in the end serves some political elite who decide who will know about things and who won't, and those who are uninformed will never complain, and that connects it to communication basically. Okay, so we didn't need this. Okay, so that's the end of the video from Chomsky, and as he ends up with saying that uh, basically labeling happens. This is the flag, it's the fourth filter that Chomsky mentions when it comes to mass communication and media. Like, people are named, they are given bad names. He mentions the 60s, what the students were doing in the 60s, but they were questioning US involvement in war. And they were doing it like the whole of the US was, uh, was the US campuses were really difficult to manage by the government. And something else also happened, because in psychology, the US focused on behaviorism, like human beings are the product of their immediate environment. So if you can construct a good environment, you will get good people out of it. Whereas in Europe, psychologists, especially Carl Gustav Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist, was challenging the idea of behaviorism. And basically, the 60s, the uprising on campuses in the 60s in elite universities in the US and everywhere in the education system told the US psychologists that behaviorism was wrong. And it was then that they shifted towards a larger, broader understanding of the human psyche. And they just let behaviorism go, although still the US attitude towards human nature is kind of you can control it. But as we see, you can't. You can control human behavior to a certain level, and you can't just. It's the example that Sigmund Freud gives, that it's like a pressure cooker. The pressure cooker can contain pressure to a limit. If it goes beyond that, it will just explode, destroying everything. That's happening. That's happening in education systems. We are also thinking that why are we getting in Pakistan, especially, most of the extremists out of the functioning university system? Like the bigger minds are coming out of that. And we think, why is it happening? Because we are not having a religious extremist curriculum. No, we are not having a religious extremist curriculum. But at the same time, we are having a very controlled curriculum, a very controlled testing and evaluation system, and a grading system that basically in the end brings students to, like, it impersonalizes individuals. Like it doesn't give any authority to individuals as human beings, but rather it checks and teaches, like the system that we have. It checks and teaches on the basis of assignments given and uh, right boxes ticked, and then there is a grade. So most of the time we don't know who the students are. This is happening especially more severely during COVID. So overall, what Chomsky says is that we are living in a society where the powerful elite and also who have money and political power, like who have money, basically the corporate elite is controlling the world. It is controlling the political system. It is controlling the system of law and justice. It is controlling the media system, and it is controlling the education system. His call is to understand this fact and make sure that you don't let people make you out puppets of their choice. Like this is what Chomsky is saying, and he has similar thoughts about uh, education as he had about media. So he's holistically evaluating a society. That's it for today. Thank you. We'll have a class on Wednesday. We'll discuss the whole thing in detail and then we'll move to another topic.